What's happening, everybody? We got a UFC fight night this week, and Nasruddin Imavov taking on Jared Cannonier in the main event. And in this video, I'm going to be breaking down all of the fights from a DraftKings perspective, and then also giving out a couple of bets that I'm placing for the card. If you guys could do me a favor while you're watching this, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We also did a giveaway last week for UFC 302. I've got the winner right here. So what we did last week, which was which fighter priced under 8K would score the most fantasy points, and it was a blowout. The winner ended up being a Nico Price, who is not a very popular answer, but we do have a winner here. It is a Lionel Turner, 1929. He went with Nico Price. So, Lionel, you win a free subscription to OddsShopper. That's our betting site. DM me on Twitter, and I can get you hooked up with a link and a promo code for that. And we'll do another giveaway this week. For this week's card, I think there should be a lot of finishes on the card, handful of high-scoring fights. So let's just open it up to every single fighter on the card. Which fighter scores the most fantasy points? Could be any price range, anybody on the card. Leave your answer below in the comment section. One person who gets the right answer will be randomly selected to win a free OddsShopper subscription. But let's start breaking down this card, beginning with the main event. Jared Cannonier against Nasruddin Imavov. And it's so hard to know where Cannonier is at this point in his career because he is 40 years old. He's coming off a layoff after he had an injury. So we haven't seen Cannonier fight in just about a year, almost a year exactly. And this is actually a little bit of a tilting fight for me to remember because some people might recall this in our Discord channel, but I had what would have been the nuts in the $15 for this UFC fight night, Vettori against Cannonier. All I needed was Vettori to beat Cannonier, and I would have come in first place in the $15, just split with one other person. Vettori wins the first round, and then Cannonier just takes over, absolutely put an ass whooping on Marvin Vettori. What's really important about that, though, is I thought that was the best Cannonier has ever looked in his entire career at 39 years old, but then he gets hurt. He has the long layoff. Now he's 40 years old. It does make it a little bit hard to know exactly where he is at in his career and what he's going to look like. He's 40 years old. The end is going to be soon. There's going to be a day that Jared Cannonier shows up and just like, oh, this is not the same elite level fighter anymore. And I do think that if we get the Jared Cannonier from a year ago against Imavov, I think he probably kicks his ass in this fight. The problem is that we just don't know that that is going to be the case. Imavov is much younger. He's also likely going to be making some rapid improvements at this point in his career because he has looked better in some of his progressive fights. The win over Roman Dolidze, Imavov looked terrific in the first round. It was a 10-8, nearly had the fight finished. Actually put such an ass whooping on Dolidze in that fight that he kind of gassed himself out. What were the strikes? Yeah, he ended up landing 51 significant strikes in the first round, 69 total strikes. So did fatigue himself a little bit after, well, I should say during that for the rest of the fight. So this is a really tough fight. It's a close one for me to call, but the pricing is very odd on DraftKings. So this is nearly a pick 'em in the betting market, but Cannonier is $7,600. That's why he's my lean for the main event. I think the winner should score pretty well. I'm going to be leaning towards Cannonier in what is kind of a coin flip fight because he has the lower price tag. We also have him projected for slightly less ownership. We have Cannonier projected for 36% ownership just about, whereas Imavov is at 39%. So I'm going all in on this fight, leaning a little bit more towards Cannonier. I have him in 60% of my lineups to 40% on Imavov, which does have me overweight to both sides of the main event. In the co-main event, another one that's a little bit odd, Dominic Reyes going up against Dustin Jacoby, and Dominic Reyes also coming off a pretty long layoff. He has not fought in a year and a half, and I really do think Reyes could use that time off to really recover his chin. We know how bad his durability has looked in recent fights, and if we look through the last few fights of Dominic Reyes' career, where starting with the John Jones fight, which in my opinion, this is one of the worst robberies in UFC history. I thought that was a clear 48-47 win for Dominic Reyes. He gets robbed, and then his career just totally falls off a cliff after that. He fights Jan Blachowicz, gets knocked out in the second round when he's fighting for the belt after John steps away. Then he gets a fight against Yuri Prochazka, where Reyes looked good in the early going, but it is just so hard to keep up with Prochazka if you're just going shot for shot. And Prochazka just had the better durability. He was able to outlast him, finishes him in the second round with a spinning elbow, which was one of the most brutal knockouts you'll ever see. And then you get Dominic Reyes going up against Ryan Spahn. It was a step down for him in competition, and he still gets sparked about a minute into that fight. So it's hard to not be really concerned about where Dominic Reyes is in terms of his durability at this point in his career. He is the more talented fighter, in my opinion, than Dustin Jacoby. It's just a matter of how shot is Dominic Reyes at this point in his career. If he is totally shot and just can't handle shots, then yeah, I guess there's a scenario where Dustin Jacoby just knocks him out in the first round. But I think the most likely scenario here is that Reyes is going to come in with a very cautious game plan because he has been finished in his most recent fights 3 times in a row. And if that is the case, there isn't much wrestling upside in this fight. I think it's going to be a kickboxing fight that takes place on the feet, and it could be a fairly low-scoring decision. So not a fight that I have all that much interest in. If I am playing one side, I do prefer Dominic Reyes. He's only projected for 15% ownership. And if the time off has allowed him to recoup and recover, then I do think that there's a chance that maybe he'll look, at least live as an underdog. And the field isn't really giving him that chance, considering he's currently only projected for 15% ownership. So some shares of Dominic Reyes just to be contrarian, but I don't really feel great about his odds of winning. It's just relative to his ownership. I think he's a little bit underowned. Next fight that we have here, it is Raul Rosas Jr. against Ricky Turcios. I love targeting this fight. This was a fight that was supposed to take place a few months ago, and then it ended up being where right before the fight, we had Raul Rosas Jr. was not feeling all that well, supposedly collapsed in the locker room, getting ready to warm up for the fight. So fight gets called off just like minutes before Rosas was supposed to be making the walk to the octagon. And I think this is a pretty favorable matchup on paper for Rosas. We know he's a great wrestler and a great grappler, but he doesn't always show the best cardio. And then something else to be concerned about when it comes to Rosas, that the striking also isn't really totally developed, but he's going to be fighting Turcios, who only has a 45% takedown defense. We've seen Turcios taken down numerous times over the course of his career. You see his last fight against Kevin Natividad, he was taken down 7 times. Against Brady Heastand, when he fought in the Ultimate Fighter, he was taken down 6 times in that fight, and that was the Ultimate Fighter. I think it was the Ultimate Fighter finale that matchup was. So I think that if Rosas wins, he's probably going to be landing a bunch of takedowns, have a bunch of control time, rack up a really big fantasy score. But if some of the cardio issues end up being an issue for all Rosas Jr., which we saw, for instance, in the fight against Christian Rodriguez, although also I think we now know that Christian Rodriguez is a pretty high-level opponent. I think he was a little bit underrated going into that fight. But if Rosas does start to tire out in the second or later stages of the third round, I do think Turcios could take over in the later stages. So I think the most likely scenario is that Rosas wins, potentially by submission. Even if he wins by decision, I think he would score a really big fantasy score because of the takedowns. So I think this is a really good fight to target. It should be fought at a really high pace. It's either going to be Rosas early or potentially by decision, or Turcios winning in the third round. My lean is towards Raul Rosas Jr. He's also expected to be somewhat popular, mid 20%, but nothing really crazy popular. So he's one of my favorite overall spend up options on the slate. I have Rosas in about half my lineups. And then Turcios on the other side, only projected for 15% ownership. So I'm slightly overweight to him, getting to him in 19% of my lineups. A great fight to be targeting overall. Next fight is another one that I think is a pretty good fight to target. Bruno Ferreira against Dustin Stoltzfus. And I think this is a pretty good matchup for Ferreira. Stoltzfus is somebody who's very reliant on his wrestling, doesn't have the best striking, and also has very poor durability. And we have seen Stoltzfus knocked out, and oftentimes knocked out very early in some of his fights. And I do think that's something that's very live to happen here. Stoltzfus is basically going to have to be on high alert for being in danger the entirety of the first round. If the fight does get extended past the first round, then there's a scenario where maybe we could see Stoltzfus' wrestling tire out Bruno Ferreira. But I think what's most likely to happen here is a Ferreira knockout either in the first or second round. He's another pay-up option I'm liking a pretty good amount. I have him in 40% of my lineups. Stoltzfus, not a punt that I'm really taking all that many chances on the low end. Next fight here, it is another one. So the main card has most of my favorite fights to target on the slate. And Julian Marquez taking on Zach Reese. Let's see, what are the current odds here on this to finish inside? All right, so anywhere from minus 165 to minus 180 at the time I'm recording. Those are the odds for this fight to finish under 1.5 rounds. For it to finish inside the distance is anywhere from minus 600 to minus 800. This fight is also priced in the mid-range. All this is to say that whoever wins this fight should win by finish, and considering the price point on these fighters is very, very likely to be in the winning lineup. So I think this is a fight that we want to be targeting very, very heavily. I have more confidence in the Julian Marquez side. I think he's a little bit better everywhere. He's also a little bit more proven. We've seen Julian Marquez also as somebody who's extremely durable. Even though he's been finished in some of his fights, it takes a massive amount of damage to put away Julian Marquez. So for reference, the fight that he had against Gregory Rodriguez, Rodriguez finishes him in the first round, but it was on 3 knockdowns and 49 significant strikes. And we know how hard Gregory Rodriguez hits. So even though we've seen Marquez finished, I still do think he has pretty good durability. And I do think he probably has better durability than Zach Reese, which even though that's kind of untested, it's just because Zach Reese, we know so little about him. So if this is going to be a war, which the betting odds indicate it's going to be, I do trust the Julian Marquez side a little bit more, but this is still a very, very good fight to be targeting. I currently have Marquez in 53% of lineups. I have Reese in 40%, so a little bit of a lean towards Marquez, but this is a fight. If you guys are playing single entry, it's a fight you want to be targeting. Large field tournaments, I'm going to have one side of the fight in nearly all of my lineups. I mean, you see here I have, 94% exposure I have to this fight. So one of the top fights over on the slate to target. I have a slight lean towards Julian Marquez. I think the winner is going to be in the optimal lineup on DraftKings this weekend. Now, there have been a lot of fights so far that I've really liked targeting. The next one is also going to be a fight that I have some interest in. But then once we get past this, and especially to some of the opening fights on the card, there's a lot of fights that I'm just barely going to be having exposure to. But Miguel Baeza against Punahele Soriano. The biggest concern I have with Soriano is he just doesn't do all that much. He has big power. We saw in his last fight against Dustin Stoltzfus, who we also just talked about being on this card. I thought that Soriano was going to end up knocking out Stoltzfus. A lot of other people did as well. Soriano was, I think, something like a -200, -250 favorite. But what ended up happening is Soriano just didn't do anything. He even had Stoltzfus hurt multiple times, but just didn't follow up or really do all that much. And then he still ended up gassing out kind of in the second round and got finished by Dustin Stoltzfus. And Miguel Baeza, I think, could put a pretty good pace and pressure on Soriano. He's a very active fighter, doesn't shoot or land takedowns all that frequently, just 0.44 per 15 minutes. But Miguel Baeza moves forward a lot, puts a lot of pressure on. He lands nearly 5 significant strikes per minute. And I do think that is something that could end up breaking Punahele Soriano in this matchup. Soriano's live just because he has big power, but his output has been so low in recent fights that he's not going to have that many opportunities to knock out a fighter like Baeza. So I won't totally write him off. I'll have a couple shares of him, but my preferred side is certainly going to be Baeza, who's currently in 39% of my lineups. I think he wins by second round finish. I think Soriano starts to tire. Baeza puts a pace on him, gets him out of there in the second round. Next fights that we have to talk about, and this is where we're going to see some spots that are just not going to be quite as interesting from a DraftKings purpose. Thiago Moises against Ludovic Klein. This is a mid-range fight, and a lot of Thiago Moises fights are not really all that great for DraftKings purposes. When he's winning, he's kind of controlling the pace, and it's with kind of low output, keeping at a distance, single strikes, not putting combinations together, leg kicks, jab, straight, and it's all just one shot at a time. So he only lands 2.47 significant strikes per minute. Moises is a great grappler, but he's not a great wrestler. He lands 1.64 takedowns per 15 minutes. And I also think it's going to be difficult for him to get takedowns against Ludovic Klein, who defends takedowns in an 83% clip. So I think this fight probably does take place on the feet, and Klein is the better and higher output striker of the two. So I'm picking Klein to win. I think he wins by decision, but not a fight that I'm all that interested in. I'm also not super confident in Klein. He's my lean, so I'll be playing a little bit more of him if I had to choose one side. But overall, it's not a fight that I think we have to be targeting this weekend. Charles Radke against Carlos Praches. And I think the line is too wide for this fight. I might end up betting Radke. I haven't pulled the trigger on it yet. He's right around plus 200. And just the way the line has been moving in favor of Praches, I think we could end up seeing this line end up being more towards Radke plus 200, plus 210. The initial opening line did have Praches as a really big favorite, and then it slowly got bet in the other direction. Praches went down to a minus 180 favorite. Now the line slowly creeping back in favor of Praches. And I think this is a really close fight. Particularly because in Praches' last outing, it came against Trevin Giles, and Praches was really hyped up for that fight. He was a really big favorite, and he lost the first round. Looked pretty shitty in it as well. Giles landed 35 significant strikes to 24 for Praches. And then in the second round, Giles landed 33 significant strikes to 13 for Praches. But Praches just ended up landing the big shot in the late stages of the second round that ultimately KO'd Trevin Giles in that spot. But I don't think Radke has the same durability issues that Giles has. I mean, how many times have we seen Giles finished? KO'd by Praches, sub by Bonfim, KO'd by Michael Morales, KO'd by Dricus Duplessis, couple submissions here. So, I mean, we've seen Giles finish so many times that it's hard for me to just look at Praches, who was the minute loser in that matchup against Giles, and just be like, oh yeah, he's just going to finish anybody once you get into like the later stages of fights. So I think Radke is pretty live in this spot. So I do think this is pretty close to a 50-50 sort of fight, even though there is a really big favorite here in Praches. So with that being the case, I think Radke is a live underdog. Not one of my favorite underdogs overall for the slate, but he's somebody who I have some interest in. I have 15% of him. He's projected for 17% ownership. I'll take some underdog shots on him, and I'm hoping we can get a plus 200 line. If we don't, I'm good betting him at like plus 190. So I am planning on betting Radke, just waiting with hopes of getting a slightly better number. The next fight we have here, it is Brad Katona against Jesse Butler. And Katona is anywhere from a minus 650 to actually a minus 850 favorite for this fight. Yeah, where is it? Which book? It is... SX Bet has him at, minus 852 on Brad Katona. So he's a ridiculously sized favorite, and Jesse Butler, probably not a UFC caliber fighter. The one time we saw him in the UFC, he fought Jim Miller on short notice. Jim Miller just knocked him out cold with like pretty much the first strike he threw of the entire fight. So fight ends in 23 seconds. Jim Miller lands the one strike that knocks him down, gets a couple of ground and pound shots after that, and that's where you get the 3 significant strikes. So it's hard to really think that Jesse Butler belongs at this level, but Brad Katona himself isn't necessarily the highest level fighter in the bantamweight division either. The biggest issue I have with Katona, I pick him to win. I think he should score decently well on DraftKings, but he's $9,600. And with him being that expensive and there not being too many cheap punt options that I really like, I'm finding it difficult to get to that much exposure to Katona. I mean, I'm picking him to win. I'm going to pick him to win by finish, but I only have him in 14% of lineups right now. It's just an issue with what his salary is. So Katona hopefully doesn't break the slate and score a billion fantasy points, because I'm not going to be able to fit him into that many of my lineups. The next fight is Andrea Lee against Montana De La Rosa. These two fought, how long ago was it now? Where is it? Here it is, all the way back in 2019. So they fought almost exactly 5 years ago. In that fight, Andrea Lee ended up winning, but you'll see why this is not a great fight to be targeting for DFS perspective, especially on the Andrea Lee side. In a win, she landed 73 significant strikes, 82 total strikes. She did have 1 takedown landed. If I'm playing one side of this fight, I'm going to say that it should be Montana De La Rosa, because she does have the wrestling advantage. Andrea Lee also has started to look kind of old in her recent fights. She has lost 4 fights in a row, hasn't looked great in a bunch of those outings. And Montana De La Rosa, the younger fighter, we haven't really seen massive improvements out of her, but she has a somewhat friendly DraftKings scoring game just because her path to victory is always through the wrestling. She lands takedowns 1.71 per 15 minutes. Not like a crazy high amount, but it's a lot of it because in the fight she wins, we do see her land like 4, 5, 6 takedowns. In the fight she loses, she just doesn't typically land any takedowns. So it does bring down her average a little bit. And then Andrea Lee only defends takedowns at a 55% clip. So if this is the same Andrea Lee that we saw in the first fight, she probably does enough to keep it standing and win a point decision. But if she is aging a little bit here, which could be the case, we could see Montana De La Rosa land a few takedowns, get some control time, and end up winning in that way. So I'm not going to be playing Andrea Lee for DraftKings purposes. I'll take some shots on Montana De La Rosa, but a really, really low priority fight to target. If you're playing like 1, 2, 3 lineups, perfectly reasonable. Just completely ignore this fight. John Castaneda against Danil Marcos. Another fight that I don't have all that much interest in. We've seen Marcos in some of his recent fights just kind of lackluster for DraftKings scoring. The fight against Hiroshi Long, he did land 81 significant strikes. He was very close to finishing that fight in his defense, but then it ends up being a fight that ends up being, I think it was an eye poke that led to the no contest. But the fight before that which was a fight where Daniil Marcos wins a split decision over Davy Grant. I personally thought Grant won, but it was a very competitive fight. Grant lands 70 significant strikes. Marcos lands just 48. And then we saw also on the Contender Series, Marcos wins a decision, but only lands 81 significant strikes. And now in this fight against John Castaneda, he's the better wrestler, in my opinion. Marcos is the better striker. Castaneda does land nearly 2 takedowns per 15 minutes. But Marcos' takedown defense looked really good in the UFC at this point, 89%. And with him having the striking advantage, what I think is likely to happen in this fight is Castaneda is going to look for takedowns. I think he's going to struggle to get them. And then Marcos is going to win the striking exchanges and probably wins a relatively competitive decision that I don't think scores all that well for DraftKings. So picking Marcos to win by decision, but another fight that I don't have all that much interest in targeting. One more fight here that I do think is one that we should have interest in, Denise Gomes against Eduardo Mora. And this is a wrestler-grappler versus striker matchup, and one that I think is probably a little bit more live to finish than what the betting odds might suggest. I do have a bet on this fight. I bet Denise Gomes plus 470 to win by KO. The reason is because we know Gomes is big power. If you look at her fights in the UFC, she knocked out Yasmin Jauregui in less than a minute, which is a super impressive win because I think Jauregui is somebody who could potentially be a future title contender. We also saw her knock out Bruna Brazil. So big power in the hands of Denise Gomes. And Eduardo Mora appears to have very, very poor striking. What she's going to be looking to do is she's going to look to wrestle. She's going to look to get takedowns, which she might be able to do. She lands north of 5 takedowns per 15 minutes. Denise Gomes only has a 47% takedown defense. The difference, though, is Mora's fought very, very low-level competition in her career, and Denise Gomes has been fighting pretty high-level competition at the UFC. So this is arguably the easiest matchup that we've seen Denise Gomes have, and this is certainly the most difficult matchup that Mora has had. So with that being the case, I do think Gomes is live for a finish. I don't think she's going to be all that popular as an underdog. We only have a projected right around 21% ownership. I've earned about a third of my lineup, so I do like her a good amount as an underdog, but I don't want to write off Mora either because if she is able to land takedowns, then I think she could have a pretty good DraftKings score herself. And, it is something that Denise Gomes has struggled with at times in the past. So a pretty good fight to be targeting. I am getting to more of Gomes. There's also a little bit of leverage here because Mora is projected for nearly 30% ownership. So the way I'm playing this right now, I've got right around even with the field on Mora. I have her in 27% of my lineups relative to the 28% projected ownership. And then I am pretty well overweight to Denise Gomes with that 31% exposure in my current lineup. So I like Gomes, betting her to win by finish. If she does end up coming through with that KO, it'll probably be a pretty nice Saturday for me. Next fight is Cody Stamann against Taylor Lapilus. It's funny, this is one of the highest level fights on the entire card, in my opinion, but it's probably not going to be all that exciting. It's not going to score all that well for DraftKings purposes in all likelihood, and it's only the second fight overall on the card. It's another one that I have a bet on as well. You could currently bet Cody Stamann anywhere from the best available line is on Bet Online. He's plus 239. DraftKings has it at plus 225. FanDuel has it plus 220. And I do think on paper, this is a pretty good matchup for Taylor Lapilus. The problem, though, is the line is so wide. I just don't agree with how wide it is. If you look at Taylor Lapilus, he's somebody who's a point fighter. He's reliant on just outstriking his opponents. And the issue you could get into with this fight is I think it does go to the distance. And I also think that it's going to be relatively competitive. I think Cody Stamann's going to look to shoot takedowns because Lapilus has good takedown defense. I think he's probably going to struggle to get them. Maybe he's able to land a couple of them, though. And you just get to a point where it's going to be a very competitive decision. And it's going to be, what do the judges favor more? Are they going to favor the wrestling, the control time, and the groundwork of Cody Stamann? Or is it going to be some of the striking of Taylor Lapilus? But Lapilus doesn't have big power, so I don't even know there's going to be that much damage to be had in this fight. So I think it's going to be competitive. I think it's not going to score well for DraftKings. If I had to play one side on DK, it would be Cody Stamann. But of my top 150 lineups, he's in 3 or 4 of them at the moment. So not somebody I'm really interested in. I think Lapilus is very unlikely to be in an optimal lineup, so I have no interest in him at all. But I'm betting Cody Stamann to win. And I think the most likely scenario is Lapilus wins the decision, but competitive enough to where I think the line is too wide. And I think the value side is Cody Stamann. In the opening card on the fight, it is a very, very low-level women's MMA fight. Ryan Dos Santos taking on Pooja Tomar, and there isn't that much information available on either of these fighters, particularly Tumar, because she's so inexperienced and they've both fought really, really low levels of competition. This is probably not a fight that belongs in the UFC. If you do look at Dos Santos, she's anywhere from like a minus 330 to minus 370 favorite. The fight is also expected to go the distance. It's just not a fight that I have all that great of a read on. Like, I'll have to pick Dos Santos to win because I think she has a wrestling and grappling advantage. She's got more experience. And Tumar, we've seen her fight really nobody of any kind of meaningful quality, and she's even looked bad in some of those fights. But it's just hard for me to have all that confidence to pay up for Dos Santos at an expensive price tag in a fight that is also expected to go to the judges' scorecard. So I won't be playing that much of this one on DraftKings either, and really no lean for betting. I don't see an angle for that either. So that's going to do it for us today, guys. If you haven't done yet, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, leave a comment below which fighter scores the most DraftKings fantasy points on the card. Give yourself a chance to win a free Odd Shopper subscription. If you do want to sign up for the Sims tools we have here at Stokastic, links for that are also below in the description box. So thank you guys very much for watching. Good luck and enjoy the card this weekend.